Hey friends, how's it going? My name is Gabby. Welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be doing another round of if you like this book, I think you should also check out this book. And this is a video recommendation series that I've been doing for a number of years on my channel, so if you are interested in more videos like this, I will have those linked down below. I've done a number of videos that's not only like, if you like this book, check out this book, but I've also done videos that are like, if you like this book, I think you should watch this movie or TV show as well. But for this video, I'm going to be recommending certain books with specific books for different kinds of reasons. I have a number of different thrillers on this list, romance books, horror books, like there really is so many different genres covered in this video, but it's one of my favorite things to do to find similarities between books. Sometimes it's because they have similar plot lines, and other times it's just because they give me similar vibes. Alright, so kicking off this recommendations list, I have, if you liked Pet Sematary by Stephen King, then I think you should also check out The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon, because both of these books are horror books that just have so much in common. I think both of these horror books just absolutely terrify me because of how realistic they feel, and both of these stories deal with heavy themes of grief, and they both just kind of show like how far a parent is willing to go for their child. I also think if you enjoyed either of these two books, I also think it would be worth checking out Crossroads. This one is actually a horror novella. It's a pretty short one, but this one is also very comparable to these two in my opinion, because I really do think if you liked Pet Sematary and you're just looking for something that's gonna have some similar vibes, a similar plot even, I do think you would like Crossroads, because Crossroads, we're following this protagonist named Chris, and her son dies in a tragic car accident, and then shortly after that car accident, she goes to the scene of the accident like a few days later, and she accidentally like cuts her finger or something, and blood falls onto the spot where he died, and then that night, she sees who she thinks is her son outside of her window that night, and she doesn't know if somehow she's been able to bring her son back. And I think that all of these stories deal with grief in such a realistic and scary way, and I think that if you like reading horror books that deal with grief and that's something that really scares you like it does for myself, I think you would really enjoy any of these books. All of these were 5 stars for me, and I absolutely loved all 3 of them. Next one is going to be, if you like Heartstopper, the graphic novel, then I think you should check out the manga Blue Flag, because I feel like both of these are very similar. Okay, in both stories we're following these 2 boys who are starting to catch feelings for each other, and then in both stories as well we also have the situation where one of the guys is like really tall and he's more athletic and like more popular, and then he's catching feelings for a guy who's like very shy and very awkward and a lot smaller. Both of these are just very similar in that way. I do think that Blue Flag is a little bit more of like a coming of age, and the romance is very slow burn. Like, oh my gosh, and Blue Flag is about 8 volumes long, I think, whereas Heartstopper, these books, there's currently 4 volumes of Heartstopper that are out right now, and the 5th one is coming out later this year, and I do think they're similar, but I do think there's a lot more romance in the Heartstopper series. And Blue Flag, it's a lot more of a slow burn, kind of like coming of age, but it definitely has a very similar atmosphere, and if there's any manga that you're interested in getting into that has Heartstopper vibes, I think Blue Flag is a great place to start. I would also, with this recommendation, I would also recommend My Summer of You, which this one is another manga that's a boy, like it's another male-male romance between these 2 boys who are in high school, and this one I would especially recommend if you like the idea of like one of the boys being a little bit more popular and then the other boy being a little bit more awkward, and like the awkward boy doesn't really understand like what he sees in him kind of vibe. It definitely reminded me of Heartstopper in those ways, and this, oh my gosh, this first volume of My Summer of You was like 5 stars for me. It was one of my new favorites. I especially think that if you're a film lover, like if you enjoy movies, both of these boys are also obsessed with movies in this, so I just think if you enjoyed Heartstopper, I would definitely check out My Summer of You as well as Blue Flag. Alright, my next recommendation is going to be, if you like Night Film by Marisha Pessl, then I think you could also like Runtime by Katherine Ryan Howard, because both of these stories are thrillers. I think that Night Film is like one of the most unique books that I've ever read, because this one is about, it's like 600 pages long, and there's a lot of like mixed media in this book, whereas like Runtime is a little bit more of your like mainstream typical kind of thriller. But I do think that if you enjoyed Night Film, I think you could enjoy Runtime as well, because both of these books have this really like eerie atmosphere about a director and like a movie set that is just a little bit questionable, and you don't know what's real. Because in the story of Night Film, you're following this guy who's a journalist, and he's going to be trying to figure out what really happened, because this director, he had this daughter who's recently killed herself, and this director has been known to have some truly like shady stuff going on his movie sets, and so we kind of follow this this journalist as he's trying to figure out like what really happened with, you know, the director's daughter and like what's really going on his movie sets. And then in the book Runtime, this is much more of like a mainstream thriller in my opinion, where we're following this woman who's going to be an actress in a horror movie, but when she gets to the set of the horror movie, she doesn't really know what's real and what's not, and she's like the only woman that's on this entire set. Like everybody else on the set is a guy, and she just starts to feel like something could be wrong or something's going on. If you like the idea of like reading about a somewhat creepy movie set where you don't really know what's real and what's not real, a kind of shady director and things going on, I really think you could enjoy either Night Film or Runtime. I will have you know though that Night Film is a bit more of a slow burn, but it's so good, and the ending of this one is just so creepy and weird, and I just loved both of these so much. Okay, this next one might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think if you liked the book The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, I think you might also like Foe by Ian Reid. And I think the main thing that these two have in common for me is that they're both these really, really weird, kind of like subtly creepy stories where you have a stranger who's like showing up on your property saying that something's happening in the world, and you have to decide whether or not you can trust this person and what they're saying. Because, you know, in The Cabin at the End of the World, we're following these two guys who are both gay, and they have this adopted daughter named Wen, and they're at this little lake house when these four people show up on their property and they say that the world is coming to an end, and they have to perform this horrific act in order to prevent the end of the world, and our main characters don't know if they can trust these people. And then it's kind of a similar thing that's happening in Foe, where we're following this couple who like lives like out in the middle of nowhere on this little farm, and then one day there's this man who's like a stranger to them who shows up on their property, and he tells the main dude, Junior, that he's been selected for space travel, like he's been selected to travel to space, and he needs to start like undergoing training and like getting ready to travel to space. And like they don't know who this man is, they don't know if they can trust what he's saying. But I guess both of these stories just have that kind of weird eeriness in common of like somebody just showing up at your house and saying that something's going down and that something's happening in the world, and you just have to figure out whether or not you can trust them. And both of these books were 5 stars for me. Both of these books are some of my favorites of all time, but they're both also very strange, very ambiguous. They're the kind of books that don't give you a lot of answers about anything, but they just kind of have this like really weird vibe all throughout. Okay, my next one is going to be, if you enjoyed The Push, then I think you might want to check out The Perfect Child by Lucinda Berry. And honestly, both of these books, the only thing they really have in common is that they're both kind of like thriller, like psychological thriller kind of stories where the mom doesn't really get along with the child, and the child is kind of a demon. I don't know why, I feel like the best way for me to compare the vibes of these books is to say that The Push feels like the kind of story that would win an Oscar, like that the Academy would just eat this shit up and absolutely love it, whereas The Perfect Child kind of feels more like the blockbuster that's like really big in the summer because it's a little bit ridiculous and over the top, and it would never be nominated for an Oscar, but it's still like a chaotic fun time. It's like the kind of movie you go to see a blockbuster in the summer, you know? And then this is like the Academy Award winning version of the same story, if that makes sense. Because The Push is definitely a little bit less of a thriller in my opinion. It's definitely more of a psychological study on this mother, and like kind of talks about the burdens of motherhood and like how difficult motherhood can be sometimes. And I also think that if you have a young child and you're a mother, I do think this could be very difficult to read because of how vulnerable and truthful and honest this book is in a way that's just kind of like, oh, like it just really shows like the dark sides of motherhood. Whereas The Perfect Child is definitely still a dark thriller, and it also deals with a child that is just very demonic and just doesn't get along with the mother, and it's very hard to read. But I do think that The Push is probably like the better of these two books if I had to pick one. But I think if you've read The Push and you're just looking for something with a similar vibe and a similar kind of storyline, then I think you would really like The Perfect Child. I did really enjoy both of these books for different reasons. Okay, my next recommendation is gonna be if you enjoyed the book The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker. I think you might also like All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. And the main reason for this is that these are two romance books that just really gave me a similar feeling when I read them. The Simple Wild actually takes place in Alaska, whereas All Roads Lead Here, I'm pretty sure this takes place like in the mountains in Colorado. Colorado or somewhere close to that. And I think both of these stories, they just have this same kind of like small town feeling to them. I also think the love interests are just very similar in these books, or they remind me so much of each other, because in The Simple Wild, we're following this girl who's going to be going back to Alaska because her dad is a pilot there, and then it's kind of a story about how she's falling for one of the pilots that works with her dad, and his name is Jonah, and he's very like hot-headed and just kind of like hard to get along with at first, but then he ends up being like the sweetest, softest being of a human. And it just reminds me a lot of the story in All Roads Lead Here, because in this story we're following this female protagonist who, she's moving to Colorado to just kind of like get away from everything, and she ends up renting the guest house or something like that of this guy's house, and he doesn't know about it because it's his son who ended up renting it out to him. So we also have like the single dad, you know, trope happening in this book. Also, this guy, his name is Rhodes, and his character, he's also just very like hot-headed, hard to get along with at first, and then he ends up, you know, really opening up to her and being like the softest and sweetest character you've ever seen in your life. So I think if you enjoy the kind of like grumpy character trope where like the love interest is a very like grumpy man who eventually like opens up and is like the softest, then I think you could enjoy either one of these. I feel like these are the kind of romance books where the town and like the setting really plays a huge part in the overall feeling you get from the book, because I remember after reading The Simple Wild, I was like, I literally want to read every book that takes place in Alaska, and I want to go to Alaska, and it was like my whole new personality after reading this book. And I kind of felt similarly about All Roads Lead Here. It just made me want to go up to the mountains and like get away from the world and just exist in this small town. My next one is going to be that if you enjoyed No Exit by Taylor Adams, I think you might also enjoy Below by Laurel Hightower. And this comparison is a little bit random because this book is a thriller. If you know No Exit, it's a thriller, and this one, Below, is a horror novella. So you're probably like, what the heck would you make this comparison? Listen to me. If you're looking for the ambiance and like the atmosphere of a woman who's alone in a snowstorm on the road and the stakes are high, I think you could enjoy both of these books, because in No Exit, you know, we have this protagonist who is like left stranded in the middle of this blizzard. She has to pull over at this rest stop, and then at the rest stop, she thinks that she sees a child in the back of a van, and she doesn't know who the van belongs to at this rest stop. So it's kind of like this thriller that all takes place on one night, where she is just trying to figure out which one of these people at this rest stop is a child abductor, and it's a very like snowy atmosphere, very intense the entire book. Whereas Below is a story about a woman who gets kind of like a similar situation where she's trapped in a snowstorm. But this one is about how this woman, she has some car issues. Like she has some issues with her car while she's on the road, and so she has no other choice but to trust this other guy who's a truck driver. She's going to be getting in the car with him. But then it's also how about some kind of creepy ass creature, aka like the Mothman or some moth creature, I don't know. Something might be like following them, stalking them in the snow on the road. And so this one obviously definitely leans more into the horror side of things. But I do think if you're looking for something that just has a similar atmosphere of something that all takes place on one night and it's very intense and it has snowy atmosphere and it's a woman alone on the road, I think either of these could be very enjoyable for you. I will let you know that No Exit is one of my favorite thrillers of all time, and I do think that this book is the superior book out of these two. But I also think if you're looking for something that's more in the horror genre that kind of feels similar to this, I would definitely recommend Below. Okay, this next recommendation is going to involve a few romance books because it's kind of like a train of recommendations, but I think if you liked The Neighbor Favor by Christina Forrest, I think you might enjoy the book What If You and Me. And I think the main thing that these two romance books have in common is that the love interest is their neighbor. Okay, so like it's like their next door neighbor. And another thing that these two books have in common is that one of the characters is a writer, is an author, because in The Neighbor Favor, the guy, he is a fantasy author in this book, and he's going to be living next door to this girl, and like that's the romance connection that's happening. And then if What If You and Me, the guy is a firefighter, and then the girl is a horror author, like a literal horror author queen. Like what the heck, that is so cool. And so I love that not only are both of these characters like it's like the neighbors trope, like they live right next to each other, but it's also the authors, like they're both writers. And the only thing that bothered me a little bit about The Neighbor Favor is the fact that these two had actually been talking to each other online before they had met in person, and he knows that she's the one that, you know, he was talking to online, but she doesn't know that he was the one that she was talking to online. So we get a little bit of that like mistaken identity kind of trope that's happening in this book, and I didn't, you know, love the way that it was handled in this book, but I think if you're looking for another like mistaken identity kind of romance, then I would recommend Top Secret by Serena Bowen and Elle Kennedy, because this is a romance where we follow, it's a male-male romance between these two guys who are living at this frat house. They are both talking anonymously on this dating app, and they don't even realize that they're talking to each other, and they're roommates, okay? They're literally roommates. This one has a lot of my favorite romance tropes, if you couldn't tell. It's a little bit more of what I prefer when it comes to the mistaken identity trope, because both of these two are clueless that they're talking to each other, whereas like this one, it's like he knows that she's the one that he was talking to, you know? So it's like it feels a little bit catfishy at times because he's not truthful with her right away. So I think if that bothered you at all about the neighbor favor, then I would definitely check out Top Secret, because it's just, this one's so cute. I enjoyed all of these romance books though, like I love them all so much. And then this next one is also going to be a little bit of like a 3-part recommendation, because I think if you like the book The Stranger, you know, it's the classic book The Stranger, then I think you should also check out Notes on an Execution, because both of these stories are about a man who is sitting on death row, like literally waiting to be killed. It's both about these people who are just kind of thinking about their lives and the decisions that they've made, and they're both just very thought-provoking and very interesting. You know, Notes on an Execution is one of my favorite books that I've ever read in my freaking life, and then after I read this book, I read The Stranger for a different video that I was working on, and I was like, oh my gosh, like I know The Stranger is a classic, but it was reminding me so much of this book when I had read it. But Notes on an Execution is definitely my preferred book out of these two, but if you are one of those individuals who has read The Stranger because it's a classic and you haven't read Notes on an Execution, I would highly recommend checking out Notes on an Execution, because this one is also, it's about a man who's like sitting on death row because he's a serial killer. But it's also interesting because this story is told from the perspective of the 3 women who are in his life. And so in this story, we get the perspective of his mother, we get the perspective of his sister, like the sister of the woman that he's falling in love with, and then we also get the perspective of a detective. And this book is just so well written. It's just one of the most beautifully written books that I've ever read in my life, and I still think about it all the time. And then I also think that if you enjoyed Notes on an Execution, I think you should also check out the book The Quiet Tenant, because much like Notes on an Execution, The Quiet Tenant also follows the story of a serial killer through the perspective of different women in his life. Notes on an Execution and The Quiet Tenant are a little bit different though, at least with the perspectives that we're getting, because in this story, The Quiet Tenant, he's still very much like an active serial killer. He's not caught, you know, whereas like in this book, he's literally sitting on death row, like waiting to be killed essentially. But this book, he's still very much active, and we follow from the perspective of a woman that he's been holding captive for 5 years. So in this book, he's not just like killing women, he's also like holding them captive, which is a little bit different from this. But we follow from her point of view in this book. We also follow from the point of view of the woman who's like currently falling in love with him, like this waitress. And then we also follow from the point of view of his 13-year-old daughter. This book is a little bit different, but it does have so many similar themes to Notes on an Execution that I do think if you read one, you would enjoy the other as well. I also do think that this book, much like Notes on an Execution, is just written so beautifully. Like the writing is definitely one of the biggest standout things that I can say about this book, and for both of these books, honestly, like they're just so well written. I do think Notes on an Execution is still like my top favorite out of all of these books mentioned in this little moment right here, but I still think it's worth checking out, and it's so freaking good. And the last recommendation that I have for this video is that if you liked The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang, I think you might also enjoy Business or Pleasure by Rachel Lynn Solomon, and that would be because of the whole aspect of, you know, there's like the trope in this book of a character kind of teaching the other character some tips and tricks in the bedroom. So in The Kiss Quotient, we're following this character named Stella. She's very mathematical and she has Asperger's, and she just doesn't feel like she knows what she's doing when it comes to like the bedroom and things. So it's about how she hires this guy named Michael, who's an escort, and she hires him to help teach her some things in the bedroom so that she can feel more comfortable and more confident when it comes to those times in the bedroom. And then in Business or Pleasure, we kind of have a little bit of a different situation, but we're following this girl named Chandler, and she's a ghostwriter. And then we also follow this guy named Finn Walsh, and he's an actor, and his team essentially like hires her to ghostwrite his next book. What they don't realize is that they had a one-night stand like shortly before they knew they were going to be working together, and he was like terrible in the bedroom, and she didn't know how to tell him that, so she like bounced and like left the next morning. And so now it's this awkward situation where they're going to be working together, and she kind of admits to him that she's like, yeah, it was not great for me. Like, it just didn't really do it for me, and he's like horrified to learn that like he's not as good in the bedroom as he thought he was. So then it's a kind of reverse situation of the kiss quotient where she's gonna be teaching him some tricks in the bedroom and like teaching him how to properly please a woman. And I discovered that I really do love that trope in romance books. Like, I love a good trope where someone's trying to teach someone else like how to be better in the bedroom. Like, I just think it's so entertaining to read. So I think if you liked that aspect of the kiss quotient, I do think you would like Business or Pleasure. And this book also reminds me a little bit of The Roommate, because in The Roommate we also do have a situation where these two characters are kind of like teaching each other different things in the bedroom, except the difference is that he is a porn star. So like, it's a little bit more intense on the sex in this book for sure, but I do think that if you liked this, you might also enjoy this one as well, so I had to mention it. Right, so those are all of the different book recommendations that I have today. You'll have to let me know if you agree or disagree with any of these recommendations, or if you could recommend me any other books that would also fit into these book recommendations. I just have so much fun trying to find similarities between the books that I'm reading, and so I really enjoy making videos like this. I will have, once again, all of the videos linked down below that I've done previously that are just like this if you're looking for more recommendations of this kind. And thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with another video. Bye!